I'm Bob Crawford.
And I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now.
Well, you were all so kind in submitting your questions to us, and we finally have your questions episode.
That's right, and we have some great ones. In fact, some that got our minds spinning so much, we're going to later on dedicate an episode to at least one of these questions, like a whole episode. And so it's great, and you guys have been so gracious. And if we didn't get to your question on this one, we apologize, but we did get most of them.
That's right, we did.
And we got some great experts to answer these questions.
Yeah, and all the questions were great, and each question could be its own episode.
Agreed. And we got, I love it. We got Heather Cox Richardson to answer a question, who's wrote the history of the Republican Party that Bob and I both love. It's called To Make Men Free. We got Brian Odom at NASA to answer a question about NASA. We got Bruce Carlson, and even a few questions that we even answered for you. Bob, you're stuffed up, man. How you feeling?
I've been sick for weeks, but you know what? This is the season, and everybody I meet has been dealing with some kind of a infection, sinus infection or stomach virus, and so my home is no different than your home, and these things these things are very communicable.
That's right.
If you have small children in school, you are no stranger to these illnesses.
You send them off to daycare or to school, and they come home with infections. It's like that monkey from Outbreak. Like they come back, and everyone's like, "Why did we let this thing in here?" Yep, but like all things, infections pass, as do years, and so this is airing for you guys. It's our first episode of 2017, and we hope that you have a great year, and keep listening to us, and we'll keep making programming for you.
Thank you for all your support, everybody.
Well, our first question today comes to us from Dale Martin, who asked about Warren G. Harding's legacy and the corruption of his administration. And here's the question.
Hey, Ben. Hey, Bob. This is Dale, and I'm recording this in my backyard in central Massachusetts. But my question actually is related to where I grew up, which was in central Ohio, and specifically in a town called Marion, Ohio, which is known for a few things. One interesting fact about Marion is that huge crawler thing that they used to use to move the space shuttle and the Apollo rockets, that was built right in Marion, Ohio. And there are a few famous people from Marion, Ohio. One is Rod Serling. Another is Jim Thorpe, who was from central Ohio. And lastly, probably most famous, was President Warren G. Harding. Now, Marion considers him a local hero, and I believe that the monument in Marion is the largest monument to a president outside of Washington, D.C., and it's huge. And when I was growing up there used to be an event every year called the Harding Pilgrimage, and as a Boy Scout, we would march in a parade, and it would end up at his memorial, and then there would be a service in his honor every year. Now, it's my understanding that outside of his hometown, some people think that he wasn't such a great president. Specifically, what I've heard is that he had a fairly corrupt cabinet. So my question for you guys is, of all the administrations through our history, who had the most unusual cabinet, possibly who had the most corrupt cabinet? And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that. Thanks.
And to answer Dale's question, we got in touch with Heather Cox Richardson, a professor of history at Boston College, who is a specialist on this topic. She's written several books on American history, most recently To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party, which was published in 2014, and which we read actually in preparation for our interview with Doug High back in May. So here is Dr. Richardson's answer.
Hi, Dale. I had no idea so much went on in Marion, Ohio. The question about Harding's cabinet is a really interesting one because Harding went into the presidency with 3 strikes against him. The first was that he was elected in a landslide, and he really wasn't much of a presidential figure, so he was really beyond his depth. The second was a product of that, and that was the fact that what he did when he went into the presidency was to surround himself with his cronies from Ohio. They became known as the Ohio Gang. And the third strike against him was the fact that he came through the government at a time when Republicans really believed that what was best for the country was what was good for business. So what happened is he put a lot of his friends into the cabinet, into his administration, and they tended to make a profit off of it, especially Albert Fall at the Secretary of the Interior, who exchanged for money grants for friends of his to drill oil under the Naval Reserve lands out west. Teapot Dome was just one of those places. But also Harry Doherty in the Attorney General's seat, who looked the other way. Another friend was at the Veterans Bureau. They were basically doing what was best for them, for business, putting money in their own pockets, and they thought that that was what was going to be good for the country. Now, in a larger scale, that's small, although it wasn't small at the time. I mean, the Teapot Dome scandal was hundreds of thousands of dollars, but that small kind of graft and the scandals in contracting were much less important than the larger scandal. And that was that Harding put at, for example, Commerce, Herbert Hoover, and at the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. And again, both of these men believed that what was good for the wealthy was going to be good for everybody. So Mellon gave kickbacks, rebates, they slashed taxes, and Hoover worked very, very hard to pack the Commerce Department with people who would promote, as he thought, American business. And what happened was essentially because President Harding was so out of his depth, he turned the government over to businessmen who really believed that if they did well, the entire country would do well. And what they did was they created this artificial economic boom in the 1920s that, as we know, ended up stratifying wealth fairly dramatically toward the top of the scale, redistributing wealth upward, and then led to the great crash of 1929. So in terms of a corrupt administration, yes, Harding is right up there, but Harding is up there in part because of the moment he came through, in part because he packed the cabinet and the administration with his friends, and in part because he won by such a landslide that he never felt that he had to put any opponents in his cabinet. Cabinet is often used to iron out difficulties when you come in with less than a mandate. And what happens if you do that is that people look quite jealously at their competitors. He had none of those competitors in his administration, in his cabinet. They were all on the same team, and the result was, of course, a cabinet that has lived to this day as a symbol of corruption. So we'll hope that that never gets topped, but it was a great question.
Man, that is a corrupt administration. Ben, you teach about the Harding administration a little bit in your classes, don't you?
I do, Bob. I do teach about Warren G. Harding in my classes. And one of the things worth noting is that his corruption didn't just stay within his administration. He was also a terribly corrupt husband. And he was part of a sex scandal early on that he tried to sweep under the rug. And it's an interesting story because during his time as a senator, people knew that he had had an affair, but he wanted to keep it under the rug so it didn't ruin his political chances, especially when he ran for president in 1920. Well, it turns out that he wrote a bunch of letters to his mistresses, and he wanted them to burn the letters, but there was no Snapchat in 1920, so these things stuck around, and the letters that actually demonstrated that he had had these affairs, they weren't discovered until the mid-20th century, when a historian named Francis Russell got a hold of them and started writing a book on Harding and his salacious affairs. And what he discovered was that there was actually evidence of this. And the family was very upset about this, the Harding family. And so what they decided to do was to try to keep him from printing those letters. And they did it. So when Russell's book came out, there were just blank pages in there where the letters were supposed to be. Now, in return, the Harding family made an agreement that if he would leave those out, they would give the letters to the Library of Congress. Under the agreement, they would not be released until 50 years later. Well, that was 2014 when they were released. And this is one of these amazing moments where, as a teacher, I walked in the first time I taught you this U.S. history class. I said there were allegations. And then suddenly, in 2014, I had the evidence. And the letters he wrote were pretty bad. And I'm going to apologize to our audience now. I'm going to read this. It's a document. So I'm going to read it to you. So be prepared. Here is actually some of the text from one of the letters he sent to his lover, Carrie Phillips. This is while he was in the Senate. And here is the text. Wish I could take you to Mount Jerry. Wonderful spot. not in the geographies, but a heavenly place, and I have seen some passing views there and reveled in them. And that doesn't sound disgusting until you know that Mount Jerry is what Harding called his penis. And this isn't the only case of this. In fact, he sent multiple letters, including one that was just a holiday card, a season's greetings card from Jerry, just from Jerry. And I don't know how he held a pencil or anything. It's pretty amazing to me if he did. But overall, this is the type of stuff that comes out of this. Now, the interesting part of this is that they knew, and the Republican National Committee and other folks knew that she could be a liability. So they actually, to keep her quiet, they paid her between $20,000 and $25,000 and paid for her and her husband to go on a lengthy trip to Japan, which is kind of amazing to me that her husband didn't notice this was going on. Like, I'll tell you, if my wife came home right now and was like, hey, we're going on a 2-week long trip to Japan, I probably would be like, where did you get that money? And don't ask that question is not an acceptable response. So he was known to do this. We now have evidence that he fathered a child with another woman out of wedlock. So he was by all accounts a corrupt person, both at the administration and at the family level. And to conclude, I will just say that Harding himself was regularly rated one of the worst presidents in American history, which makes me laugh because the Harding family in 1964 would have tried to protect his legacy by keeping that information out. In fact, Harding himself once wrote down, I am not fit for this office and never should have been here. So, yeah, there's your Harding. Dale, you're going to have to make up your mind on whether or not that's a person that deserves a statue.
There we go. And the plot thins. Our next question comes to us from Matt Ensley, and he asked about the advent of voter-based political parties.
Hey guys, love the show. My question is, I was hoping you guys could shed some more light on how America came up with the idea for voter-based political parties in the 1790s.
That's right, and to answer this question, we got Bruce Carlson to help us out. You guys may remember him from a past episode on presidential history, and he is the host of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, one of my favorite podcasts. So here's Bruce answering the question.
Thanks for your question, Matt. The idea that people would join together and generally agree on a set of issues is as old as the Republic, in fact, older. There's a good book I was reading recently about the Continental Congress first meeting in 1774, and the author found discernible conservative and radical factions aligned on many votes, even as early as that point. And I'd say, to be most accurate, in 1790, it's really one party that forms, and that would be the Democrat-Republican Party, most notably started by Jefferson and Madison. And it forms in 1790, get this, under the guise of these two going on a botany trip. I mean, literally, Jefferson asks to be excused for a few weeks as the Secretary of State to go on a botany trip. But they are going around and gathering people who are opposed to the growing national government and the national bank. They do look at plants too. And they, along with a group of Democrat-Republican clubs that are forming around the country, build a movement of what was strong opposition to the national government. And they'll be successful in capturing Congress in the midterms of 1794 with this budding movement. So I really think that's what forms in 1790. The Federalist Party, such that it was, if anything, formed as more a counter movement, mostly organized by Alexander Hamilton and also some really strong nationalist thinking New Englanders. Because the first two presidents, Washington and Adams, while being nominally Federalist, like if you look at a history textbook, it's going to say Washington and Adams, Federalist, they would never have identified as members of a party. There was a lot of disagreement in these early parties. They weren't organized. You weren't going to find like a Federalist Party headquarters in the Capitol in Philadelphia. They're just groups of people of a like ideology. And there was a lot less discipline about how members voted. James Madison in Congress is kind of the leader of the Republican group, and he's in opposition to Alexander Hamilton and President Washington in many things during this time. But he's losing a lot of votes because he can't keep members, quote, in line. You don't have the kind of discipline that parties had today.
Our next question comes from Gabe and Michael Stiller.
Why do we have daylight savings? Because I like staying up and playing soccer every day. I mean, I can play soccer until 8 o'clock when we have daylight savings, but now it's 5 o'clock when the sun's down.
That was a great question. Ben, what did you learn researching this?
And Gabe and Michael sent us several good questions and interesting information about their family, but the one that I felt like I could field the best was this question about daylight saving time. And this is an interesting question because it's one of those things that has a lot of myths surrounding it. So, for example, a lot of people, if you read up on the internet and things like this, a lot of people will say the idea for daylight saving time came from Benjamin Franklin. And that's simply not true. They attribute it to a 1784 essay or editorial that Benjamin Franklin published in the Journal of Paris when he was living there. And it's funny because the article does talk about shifting time, but it is not a serious essay. He's basically mocking the fact that the French are spending lots of time trying to get more energy out of their candles and figure out ways to burn more candles at a lower cost. But at the same time, the elites in Paris sleep half the day away. And so he's kind of making fun of this. It's totally satirical in this beautiful Benjamin Franklin way that few Americans, save maybe Mark Twain, can do. And so what he does is he's writing in this, and here's a quote here, and he's kind of needling these guys. He says, "Your readers, who with me have never seen any signs of sunshine before noon, and seldom regard the astronomical part of the almanac, will be as much astonished as I was when they hear of his rising so early, and especially when I assure them that he gives light as soon as he rises. I am convinced of this. I am certain of this fact. One cannot be more certain of any fact. I saw it with my own eyes, and having repeated that observation the 3 following mornings, I found always precisely the same result." And so he's not really suggesting a time change there. He's mocking them, and what you'd have to get out of this is that time doesn't matter in the same way in the late 18th century it matters now. Time is created, and the need for a standardized time, which all people follow, is really something that is created by the industrial era. You don't need to have a clock when you're a farmer, because when you're a farmer, you get up and you work when the sun comes up, and you work until either the sun goes down or you're done. Time is something that really becomes important to people as industrialization takes place. And this is something in the United States that you start seeing manufacture in the early 19th century, but it's really with the creation of railroads and the need to coordinate over large distances that the time zones begin to matter. So this is, not surprisingly, when it comes about. The first discussions come about in the early 20th century. The United States finally adopts daylight saving time for the first time in 1918 as a result of the need to conserve in World War I, because basically, other countries have done this as well. Germany had already done it before the United States, and so we follow suit. It was unpopular with a lot of people, which gets at the other myth that people have, that this was something that was an idea by farmers to give them more working time. But that doesn't actually make any sense, because as I said, farmers get up and work in the morning, and they work till the work's done. They didn't like it, because if they had to hire wage labor, that means that the people would go home an hour earlier. So the idea for daylight savings time came about in 1918, but it's canceled by 1919 because there's public outrage. It comes back in 1942 in February, following the United States' involvement in World War II. We keep it on the books, and it's kind of in a haphazard way. Some states keep it, others don't, and it leads to confusion. In fact, in 1965, at one point, the cities of St. Paul, Minnesota, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, they both adopt different time zones. So you have two cities, the Twin Cities, one of which is on a different time zone, basically for two extra weeks. So it's not until 66 that there's standardization. There's mixed results. Some people follow it, some people don't. It gets to be a bigger deal again in the 1970s as a conservation measure in a response to the OPEC oil embargo. And so for a short period there, daylight saving time is year-round. It goes back, and you don't finally get the daylight saving time we have now, which begins in March until the mid-2000s in the Bush era. And if you look at who's pushing for it then, it's actually business people. A lot of folks who believe they stand to gain from there being extra daylight when people get off from work. People tend to drive more. You all know this. When it's daylight outside, you're more likely to do things. And so businesses, restaurants, all of these, they tend to be the lobbying force behind putting this in place and keeping it in place outside of wartime conservation measures. I'll also say to the Stiller brothers, this is a great question. And in fact, we've decided that we're going to give this brief answer now, but we're going to do a whole episode on the history of time in the United States that we're hopefully going to launch about the same time as daylight saving time kicks back in March. So thanks for that question, and I hope this is good enough for now.
That's right, and because it'll be daylight savings time, you need to check your local listings. All right, our next question comes to us from Brooke Fitzwater, and it's about the space program.
Hello. My question is, during the space age golden era, so to speak, the late 1960s into the 70s, people in the U.S. were really enthralled with space exploration via both humans and satellites, but eventually the excitement dwindled to the point where people don't really seem to be as eager about it as they were beforehand. Why do you think this is, and what factors do you think played a role in it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm particularly proud of it because Brooke is one of my students at Middle Tennessee State University. She's an outstanding history student, despite the fact that she seems to even be a better biology major. It's great to get to work with students who have great minds like Brooke. And she was kind enough to give us this question, and we were lucky enough to, with the Middle Tennessee State connection, get in touch with Brian Odom at NASA. He's a historian at NASA in Huntsville. And he's part of our academic family here because he is working on his PhD in public history at Middle Tennessee State. And his advisor is my wife, the illustrious Dr. Kelly Kolar. And so here is Brian Odom giving us a great answer to Brooke's question.
The question of interest in the space program today being less than it was during the Apollo program, I think we really have to understand how big of a deal these programs are, how much of a massive undertaking they are, and how important public opinion is to the successful culmination of a program like Apollo. If we go back into the beginning, in the post-World War II era, it was difficult then to generate interest in the space program because it was viewed as science fiction. Folks like Dr. Werner von Braun, Arthur C. Clarke, Willie Ley, they worked to overcome the idea that this was a fictional thing. They were very successful at it. They gave, they would write magazine articles, Collier's magazines. They, Dr. von Braun goes on Disney, a Disney program where he talks about man in space, and these things are successful in generating this interest. But the Apollo program was relatively successful in generating interest because it was born of a Cold War context where successes and failures were critical. In 1957, Sputnik revealed for that failure of America falling behind the Soviet technology, and the public perception, at least, revealed that there were things that the Soviets were doing well that America needed to improve on. That may not have been the case behind the scenes. There was no missile gap or anything like that, but it was important in generating American interest in the program. It got their attention because successes here could be transferable to nuclear warfare. So that was critical. Gagarin's orbit in 1961. Again, another one of these things in that stage. But the American success in the moon program. But we need to understand too that Apollo was never 100% popular. As the 60s wore on, as the Vietnam War expanded, as civil rights movement, civil unrest, the environment became more of an issue, people began to be critical of the money that was being spent on the Apollo program. And from 1964 to 65 forward, every year the budget was slashed, incredibly slashed. While the excitement around Apollo 11 in 1969 may have been great, it may have been an anomaly compared to the way that the space program had been at that time, because Apollo 12 through 17 continually less interest in the American public's mind until 3 of these programs are canceled. There's 18, 19, and 20 that are canceled along the way. And while we may have had, in 1973, 74, Skylab program, there's not too much attention paid to that, from the public at least. And the Apollo-Soyuz test project with the Soviets in 1975, again, not a lot of attention paid. the space shuttle program by 1981, there is some interest there because, this is American technology that's first rate, first class, and it makes space access appear to be rather routine. Now we know that's not the case because the Challenger failure in 1986, and even in 2003, the Columbia disaster. I mean, these things remind us of how important these things are and how difficult these things are. And the popular culture's interest in these is reduced by the degree of difficulty. I mean, we haven't gone out of low Earth orbit since 1972, and while we are working to kind of get back beyond low Earth orbit now with the Space Launch System, it's just 2011 we have the last space shuttle launch from Kennedy Space Center, and since then we've basically been hitching a ride with the Russians. But we are working today to remedy that again with the Space Launch System. Our commercial partners, Boeing, Lockheed, SpaceX, these folks are doing some great things. They're getting attention, and they're doing the right things. But International Space Station. The International Space Station, from a science perspective, has been a great return on that investment. But it's hard to generate mainstream popular culture's interest in these programs because they don't necessarily understand what's going on there. Hubble Space Telescope, Chandra X-ray Observatory, and the whole astronomy program, exoplanets, those are very successful programs. But again, it's hard to generate that interest. We all appreciate the images that come back from this, but the scientific returns are hard to digest for the public. With dark matter, dark energy, black holes, these things are kind of lost on us. But I think we can say, back to the question of, is this representative of a lack of interest in the space program as opposed to the way it was in Apollo? One, I would argue, Apollo was never consistently at the height of the public's interest, and today we have scientific missions that are incredibly important. Mars Curiosity rover, that the returns there, the imagery that we're getting from there is incredible. Juno to Jupiter recently, New Horizons to Pluto. These missions, they show up on the landscape, and people do pay attention. So the interest is there today as much as it ever has been. NASA's always done this, and we see this transition into, popular culture. In films like Interstellar, The Martian, these things, these are box office successes, and they continually tell this story of our quest to understand the universe, our quest to explore, to discover new planets, to understand the world beyond low Earth orbit. These things are critical to us, and I think as we go forward, as we move on, we have the James Webb Telescope coming out. It'll take us, it'll develop a science that we haven't seen before. As I mentioned before, the Mars mission, SLS, one of the places we're going to go is to explore the surface of Mars. I mean, this is very hard stuff, and it takes a long time, and it's hard to keep the public's attention over such a long duration there. But I think overall, while it may be up and down, I think it's always there. There isn't always an interest, and it's highlighted by these big successes, by new discoveries, and by future missions where human beings will go back beyond Earth orbit, as opposed to robotic rovers and that sort of thing. Not that those things aren't important; they're critical. But I think that's the key. I think we have to do something we haven't done before. To boldly go where no man has gone before. That's true, and that's what generates that interest. So I think that's critical. But I think we'll understand. In the future, there are great things around the corner. We're doing great things now. We're building a foundation to explore deep space for the first time in a long time. And I think that's critical. But in answer to that question, yes, the interest waxes and wanes, but it's fundamentally it continues to be with us, and it's what drives us and what allows us to do what we do today.
My name is Jason Comaz. This question is for Bob. Bob, you have now been living in the South for 20 years. How do you believe that moving to the South has changed your personal history narrative in terms of your education, your emotional growth, your political growth, your spiritual growth? Thank you.
Jason, that's a great question. Full disclosure, Jason Comaz and I grew up together. We are best friends. We've been very close since before third grade and right through to this very day. So, Jason, I appreciate your question. The South has given me everything in my life. It's given me my wife, my children, my career, worlds of opportunity, an incredible education. And I don't know if that has so much to do with the South itself and the time in which I live here, or if it has to do with the arc of my life and where I found myself and when I found myself there. So I moved in the mid-'90s to Charlotte, North Carolina, which at the time was going through an incredible boom, driven largely by the banking industry. But for me, who came to the New South, to Charlotte, the New South City, to do film and video production, it was the boom was being driven by the popularity of the sport of NASCAR, and it was going through its own period of great growth, and there were a lot of media opportunities within the sport. And pretty much the day I got to Charlotte, I was working on NASCAR commercials or NASCAR programs or, videos related to some aspect of the sport or the industry. And so for about 4 or 5 years, as I worked full-time in film and video production in Charlotte, NASCAR really paid the bills for me as a freelance production technician. Ultimately, I went back to school to study music at Winthrop University in Rock Hill, South Carolina, because I was looking towards the future and what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And I really wanted to learn music and know music in a very thorough way. And I was wondering what was right for me. Like, did I want to be a production technician in some aspect of the film business, or would I be happier in a classroom talking about music and teaching it, whether it be music theory or music history? I kind of thought the latter. Though I'd make less money, I would probably be spiritually more fulfilled talking about music. And that's what took me back to school and ultimately led me to Scott and Seth and becoming a part of the Avett Brothers Band, which has been just an incredible experience. Again, helped me meet my wife, and the most important relationship I've ever had in my life, and we have our 2 beautiful children. Spiritually, I've had an incredible spiritual growth while living in the South, but I don't know if I can attribute it so much to the South as to where I found myself in life while I've lived here. I've been pretty much 25 years in the North and about 25 years almost now in the South. So we're getting close to 25 years in the South. So it's kind of a 50-50 life. And, the things that have happened to me in the past 5 years of my life really pulled me towards God in a serious way. I think there were opportunities and moments living in South Jersey, but I wasn't tuned into it like I am now, and I think that that's a big part of that. As far as music goes, I played music in South Jersey, and there was not as much opportunity, I don't think, for original bands, young, starting out bands. There weren't as many clubs that, catered towards that original music. Living in South Jersey, you're near the beach, and it's more of a cover band experience that the clubs want to present to patrons. And so also when I moved here in the mid-90s, I would started to go out to clubs, and a lot of just great original music. I would almost say there was a scene in Charlotte at that point, and I know in North Carolina there was a lot going on musically throughout the whole state in that period, and I do attribute to the South versus the North. So, great question, Jason. Thank you so much for participating in this episode.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Road to Now. And a special thanks to Heather Cox Richardson, Brian Odom, Bruce Carlson, and everyone who sent in today's fantastic questions. If you've got questions, please keep sending them our way. You can email us at roadtonowcast@gmail.com, and we'll keep answering these questions in episodes like this as they come in. Today's episode was edited by Bob Crawford, and the podcast is produced by Ben Sawyer, Bob Crawford, and Ian Scotta. Today's music is by Paul DeFiglia. And please keep listening and rate us on all of the sites where you get your podcast, and continue to give us great feedback as you have been on social media. And thank you for making 2016 so great for us. We hope you and your family have a great 2017. Take care.